Okay. So you want to really get into progressivism.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting. You sent us a bunch of sources,
Hmm.
like going way back and also like what's going on like right now.
Right.
So it seems like we should try to like figure out like what progressivism is all about.
Yeah.
How it's changed over time and like what people like about it,
Hmm.
but also like uh, what are some of the problems with it and stuff.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the cool things about progressivism is like, it's not like a set of rules.
Right.
It's more like a way of thinking,
Yeah.
It's a way of approaching how society can be better. And I think your sources really show that, like, how it can be so different.
Right. Like it's not just one thing. It's a
Exactly.
bunch of different tools you can use.
Yeah, it's like a toolbox.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like instead of having, a hammer or a screwdriver, it's
Yeah.
like you have, ideas for change.
Exactly.
So for people who are like maybe new to this whole progressivism thing, could you like give us a definition of it? Like what's the main idea?
Sure. Yeah. So, like, at its heart, progressivism is about believing that things can get better,
Yeah, go ahead.
that we can fix injustices. And a big part of that is being proactive,
Right.
not just reacting to problems.
Right.
And they see the government as a tool, a powerful tool,
Right.
not something to be afraid of,
Mm.
but something that can be used to do good.
So not just like sitting around and hoping things get better,
No.
but like actually doing something.
Exactly. Yeah. Be the change you want to see.
Yeah. And your sources really point to like the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
Like that was a big turning point for progressivism.
Right.
It's like that's when it really took off.
Absolutely.
So what was happening back then that made progressivism, like start to grow?
Well, think about it. I mean, you had massive factories popping up, cities growing like crazy, but you also had this huge gap between the rich and the poor.
Okay. Yeah.
You had kids working in dangerous jobs. And people started to realize, like, hey, maybe all this progress isn't always a good thing.
Right.
And so that led to this push for things that we kind of take for granted now, like child labor laws,
Oh, yeah.
the 40-hour work week, even Theodore Roosevelt going after these big monopolies,
Mhm.
Breaking up those giant trusts to make the economy fairer.
I bet like the factory owners weren't too happy about that.
Probably not. No.
But, speaking of people who are really pushing for change,
Uh-huh.
one name that came up a lot in the sources was Jane Addams.
Yes.
She sounds amazing.
She's a great example of progressivism in action.
Okay.
It wasn't just about laws, it was about social support, too.
Okay.
She founded Hull House in Chicago,
Mhm.
which was this place where immigrants could go to get education, healthcare,
Wow.
even just a decent meal.
That's amazing.
It was all about helping people, lifting them up instead of just leaving them to struggle.
Yeah. And that's really cool because it shows how progressivism goes beyond just politics.
Yeah.
And looking at your sources, there are some themes that keep coming up,
Mm-hmm.
like economic fairness,
Mm.
civil rights,
Yeah.
healthcare.
Right.
It's a lot of stuff.
It is a big tent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for each of those areas, you can find real world examples of those ideas playing out.
Okay.
Like economic fairness, well, minimum wage laws.
Yeah.
That's a direct result of progressive thinking. Or workplace safety. Back in the day, those factories were really dangerous.
Right.
And those regulations came about because progressives pushed for them.
Right.
And Social Security. I mean, can you imagine life without that safety net for our seniors?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, that's a classic progressive win.
And that kind of makes me think like, aren't some people worried about the government getting too big, like too involved in people's lives?
Yeah.
Isn't that like a common criticism of progressivism?
It is. It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But the idea isn't to create some kind of nanny state,
Right.
where the government controls everything.
Yeah. It's more about making sure everyone has a fair chance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For progressives, the government isn't the enemy. It's a tool to level the playing field.
Right.
Think of it like a referee in a game.
Okay.
You need rules and someone to enforce them, or it's just chaos.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah,
But even if you have good intentions,
sure.
couldn't some of these policies like backfire?
Yeah.
I mean, that's another criticism I've heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes the solution ends up being worse than the problem.
Absolutely. It's true. Policies can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Take, for example, the push for affordable housing in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
Some of those large-scale projects, while well-intentioned, ended up concentrating poverty rather than alleviating it.
Oh, wow.
So it's about learning from those mistakes, adapting and refining the approach.
So it's not like they just say, oh, well, that didn't work. Let's give up.
No, it's about constantly learning and tweaking the approach.
Yeah. Okay, and another big theme in the sources is civil rights. It feels like progressivism is really connected to social justice movements.
Absolutely. I mean, progressives were at the forefront of ending slavery,
Right.
of women getting the right to vote.
Yeah.
And it was a long fight, you know?
Yeah.
It took a long time.
Yeah, like 100 years
Yeah.
of fighting for that.
Right. And the fight continues today.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the LGBTQ plus rights movement,
Right.
the push for equal pay for women.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about making sure that everyone, regardless of who they are, has the same opportunities.
And speaking of fights that are still going on,
Yeah.
healthcare is a big one right now.
It is a hot button issue.
So how does progressivism view healthcare?
Well, it comes down to this healthcare shouldn't be a luxury.
Okay.
I mean, imagine if clean water was controlled by companies
Yeah,
and you could only drink it if you could afford it.
that would be crazy.
It sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
Well, for progressives, healthcare is the same. It's a basic need.
Right.
That's why you see movements like Medicare for Hold all gaining traction.
But wouldn't something like that cost a lot of money?
It would be expensive.
And some people say that it would give the government too much control.
Mm-hmm.
So how do progressives respond to those concerns?
Well, cost is a major consideration.
Yeah.
But so is the cost of not having universal health care.
Okay.
You know, things like lost productivity, medical bankruptcies,
Right.
preventable deaths.
Yeah, that's true.
And as for government control, it's about finding a balance.
Okay.
You know, making sure people have access to quality care, but also allowing for individual choice.
Right.
It's a complex issue. There's no easy answers.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
Another area your sources talk about is making our democracy work better.
Yes.
And one thing that keeps coming up is campaign finance reform.
Right.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's about whose voices get heard the loudest, you know?
Mm,
Right now, big money can drown out the voices of everyday citizens.
right.
So campaign finance reform is about making sure that elections are about ideas, not just about who can spend the most money.
Right.
I mean, think about it. Does it seem fair that a billionaire can just outspend you and outmessage you
Yeah, that doesn't seem fair.
just because they have more money?
Yeah.
You know?
That's something to think about.
It is something to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, we can't forget about the environment.
Of course not.
It seems like caring for the planet is a big part of modern progressivism.
Absolutely. And it...
Not just thinking about what's good for us now, but for future generations.
Right. That's the idea.
Okay.
And one final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
You know, we've seen how progressivism has adapted over time,
Yeah.
you know, tackling the issues of each era.
Mm-hmm.
So as you look at the world today with all of its new challenges,
Right.
what do you think is the next frontier for this way of thinking?
Wow.
What role might you play in shaping that future?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
We encourage you to check out those sources.
Yes, definitely.
Form your own opinion.
Absolutely.
And remember, progressivism isn't just about politics.
That's right.
It's about how we create a better world together.
Exactly.
So thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.